Welcome to Mobile Legends! 5 seconds till the enemy reaches the battlefield. Smash them! All troops deployed! First blood! You have slain an enemy!
I know all these social theories can seem pretty daunting, but they're actually fairly simple to keep track of if you remember the main points. The first theory of society that I'll review is functionalism. This theory looks at how a society can exist and survive over time. Basically, functionalism states that a society is always trying to come to an equilibrium, trying to stabilize. The structures that make up a society, like institutions, will remain pretty constant and only change if absolutely necessary when the society loses stability. Remember that institutions are structures that fulfill the needs of society. There's an example of that in our society right now. The business institution has had to adapt to the huge online shopping boom. As online retail providers like Amazon draw more and more people away from retail stores down the street, those stores have to find ways to attract people again so they will take the time to stop in and shop. But it takes a lot of energy to change, so the stores will only do what is absolutely necessary to get customers again. Right, so when you think of functionalism, think of the minor changes an institution makes to find a stable balance in the society. Only change to be functional again. The next theory is conflict theory, which is just like it sounds. It focuses on how societies change and adapt over time through conflict. In any society, there is going to be conflicting viewpoints and beliefs, and people are going to take sides. Eventually, this is going to polarize the society, where one group is happy with the status quo and another group wants change. This is a very fragile state for the society, and eventually both sides will have to come to some sort of agreement, or else tear the society apart. The class struggle in 19th century Europe is an example of this process. The workers wanted change while the factory owners were happy with the way things were. The two opposing positions were merged to create a new society where the workers had slightly more power than before and the factory owners had slightly less, and everyone was content, if maybe not ecstatic about the outcome. Okay, so in conflict theory, you have two opposing sides at odds with each other that eventually lead to the creation of a new synthesized society. Conflict creating a new society. Next, we have the theory of social constructionism, which looks at what a society is, rather than how it exists or changes. In social constructionism, everything is created from the minds of the society. There's an agreement that something has meaning and value that the thing doesn't actually have intrinsically. One of the most prevalent examples today is money. It has no value on its own. It's just paper or metal or numbers in a computer. But as a society, we have agreed to give it a specific value, and that agreement actually helps to shape the society itself. So when you think of social constructionism, remember that everything only has value because we agree it has value. We construct the world around us. The final social theory here is symbolic interactionism. This one is kind of different than the other theories because it puts a lot of focus on the individual and how they behave. It is based around the idea of the meanings we give to things. Like, to me, a tree could be a source of shade, whereas for someone else, it could be the home to spiders and ants. People are created by their society. They act based on their past experiences in their lives, and the meanings they have given things. But not everyone gives the same meaning to everything. That tree could mean 10 different things to 10 different people. And even if you just look at one person, a tree can have multiple meanings, and those meanings can even change over time. The meanings we give things is based on our past experiences in society, and those meanings and our interpretations create our future society. To put it in a phrase, symbolic interactionism says that we interact with the world to give it meaning. So, to sum up this summary, we have functionalism, looking at the stability of the society, conflict theory, looking at how the society changes, social constructionism, discovering how things are given value, and finally, symbolic interactionism, learning how individuals act. Functionalism is a system of thinking based on the ideas of Emile Durkheim that looks at society from a large-scale perspective. It examines the necessary structures that make up a society and how each part helps to keep the society stable. According to functionalism, society is heading toward an equilibrium. I know it sounds a bit strange that a society can be at equilibrium, but consider the changes many businesses have had to make in response to companies like Amazon. Local businesses must adapt to find a new way to cater to customers in order to restore the balance. In the theory of functionalism, society is made from a bunch of connected structures. One structure is institutions, which are structures that meet the needs of the society, like education systems, financial institutions, businesses, marriage, laws, mass media, non-governmental organizations, medicine, religion, the military, police forces, and lots of others too. Another structure is what Durkheim called social facts. Social facts are ways of thinking and acting formed by the society that existed before any one individual and will still exist after any individual is dead. They are unique objects that cannot be influenced by an individual. They have a coercive effect over the individual that is usually only noticed when we resist against them. So, for example, one social fact is the law. It is always there, but we don't notice it until we try and break it or act against it. Some other examples are moral regulations, religious faiths, and social currents like suicide or birth rate. You might wonder how suicide can be a social fact. Well, one person committing suicide has no effect on the presence of suicide in the society. Social facts are a facet of the society itself, and, according to Durkheim, are a necessary structure. But society is more than just the sum of its parts. It is dependent on the structures that create it, just like a cell is dependent on all the little parts that make it up. Every part of the cell has a specific vital function that depends on other parts of the cell. Without everything working together smoothly, the cell would die. The same is true of a society. Every structure has a function that meets a need of the society, and all the structures work together to maintain the social equilibrium. So, for example, you have schools, which educate students so they can find good jobs and support the community. And businesses provide specialized services, and laws maintain social order. These recognized and intended consequences of institutions are known as manifest functions. But sometimes the institutions have unintended consequences. Schools allow the students and professors to make social connections, and they expose the students to new activities through extracurriculars. Businesses connect people across societies. These unrecognized and unintended consequences are called latent functions, and are often indirect effects of the institution. Now, Durkheim's main question was, what holds a society together? How can it remain relatively stable even as traditions disappear and customs change? He thought that small societies were held together by their similarities, and the individual was self-sufficient, but that only works for small societies, and we all know societies change and grow large. The small society would eventually evolve into a large society where the individual was interdependent on others. But what causes this evolution of society to occur? The most basic factor is population growth within a limited space. Suddenly, there isn't enough land for everyone to own their own farm and feed themselves, so just a few farmers grow enough food for the entire community. But now, the farmers don't have enough time for other necessities like making clothes or teaching their kids. The people who no longer have to grow food now take on different roles like tailoring or education, and everyone becomes dependent on one another for their continued well-being. People have become specialized, which forces mutual interdependence. This interdependence helps to ensure that the community won't fall apart. Now that people depend on each other for the production of goods and services, there is a need for a method of distribution and a way to control and coordinate that production and distribution. In functionalism, a change to either production, distribution, or coordination will force the others to adapt in order to maintain a stable state society. Social change is annoying and upsets the equilibrium and threatens the mutual interdependence of the people within that society. The institutions and structures of the society adapt only just enough to compensate for a change and maintain the stability of mutual interdependence. Phew, alright, that just about covers it. While functionalism is a nice way to look at society with its equilibrium of institutions all filling the needs of the society they create, there are some serious problems here. Functionalism focuses completely on the institution, with little regard for the importance of the individual. The individual is acknowledged, but nothing they do really affects the structures of society. Functionalism is also largely unable to explain social change and conflict. We know it happens, but Functionalism is so focused on maintaining the equilibrium of the society that little significant change is modeled and no conflict can occur. The structures of a society adapt only just enough to find the stability again. Right, so while there's more to understanding a society than just looking at the stable state of its parts, functionalism is helpful in understanding the workings of society by examining the functions of its integral structures. Conflict theory is a way of studying society that focuses on the inequalities of different groups in a society. It is based on the ideas of Karl Marx from the 19th century, who believed a society evolved through several stages, the most important of which were feudalism, capitalism, and finally socialism. 19th century Europe was a capitalist society, where the rich upper class, called the bourgeoisie, were a minority of the population, and the poor lower class, called the proletariat, were the majority. Now you might think that the majority would have more sway over the society, but it was actually the bourgeoisie that had the power. They owned the factories that produced everything people needed, and they sold what they produced to earn a living. The proletariat only had their labor to sell to make a living, and they were dependent on the factory owners to get paid. But this wasn't just a one-sided dependence. The factory owners were also dependent on the workers to work in the factories, though they would never admit it because they would lose some of their power. There was a significant economic inequality between the factory owners and the workers. It was this economic inequality that Marx believed would fuel a change in society. As the working class realized they were being exploited, they would unite to create a class consciousness. This class consciousness is kind of like getting everyone on the same wavelength so they can be stronger and overthrow the capitalist status quo. Marx created a model which proposed that a society where one group exploited another group economically would actually contain the seeds of its own destruction. The existing generally accepted state, or thesis, of a society would cause the formation of a reaction, or antithesis, that opposed the accepted state. In a capitalist society, the accepted thesis was that the bourgeoisie ran the factories, while the working class provided the labor. The desire of the working class to change the way things were was the antithesis. The thesis and antithesis can't exist together peacefully. One side is quite happy with the status quo and wants to leave things the way they are. The other side is looking for change because they really aren't so happy with the current state of things. The struggle between the two sides would eventually lead to a compromise, or a synthesis of the two, resolving the tension between them by creating a new state. Perhaps the synthesis here is that members of the working class begin to take on managerial positions. The few workers who become managers might create a new middle class that has even more power than the factory owners themselves. This synthesis of thesis and antithesis would eventually become a new thesis in its own right, and begin the process of creating its opposite once again. Perhaps the new middle class has become so powerful that the factory owners begin to feel threatened. The middle class is quite happy with their newfound status, but the bourgeoisie doesn't want to share. The strong influence of the middle class over everyone else has become the new thesis, and the bourgeoisie wants that to change, creating an antithesis. But maybe the bourgeoisie doesn't feel threatened, and instead, the workers are resentful of their former friends and their new power. Now, the workers want the status quo to change. The antithesis can arise from any source of unrest to oppose the thesis. Even after this struggle is settled, there would eventually be unrest again, and an antithesis would spring from that new source of unrest and tension. The idea of two opposing sides has come up many times through history. W.E.B. Du Bois was very influential in the struggle of African Americans for equal rights, and the women's suffrage movement created tension and eventually changed society. Each of these conflicts between the status quo and its opposition resolved into a new thesis, which just waited for the next source of tension to come along. Conflict theory does a wonderful job of modeling the often drastic changes that occur in a society, but it doesn't take into account the stability that a society can experience, and it doesn't explain how a society is held together, and it really doesn't like the status quo. There is much to be said for the application of conflict theory, and much that it leaves unanswered. All in all, it's another tool in our belt to understand the complexities of the society we live in. Symbolic interactionism takes a small-scale view of society. It focuses on the small-scale perspective of the interactions between individuals, like when you hang out with a friend, instead of looking at large-scale structures like education or law. By looking at the small scale, symbolic interactionism explains the individual in a society and their interactions with others, and through that, it can explain social order and change. The theory was compiled from the teachings of George Herbert Mead in the early 20th century. He believed that the development of the individual was a social process, as were the meanings individuals assigned to things. People change based on their interactions with objects, events, ideas, other people, and they assign meaning to things in order to decide how to act. For example, if I had sat under the shade of trees all my life, and I was on a long walk today and spotted a big tree, I might want to sit under it. The tree means shade on a hot day to me. Herbert Bloomer continued Mead's work and actually coined the term symbolic interactionism to describe this theory of society. He proposed 3 tenets to explain symbolic interactionism. Let's say I do decide to sit under that tree on my long walk today. I step off the path and sit down and lean back against the trunk. Bloomer's first tenet was that we act based on the meaning we have given something. I consider the tree as a place to rest, so I'll go lean against it. As I'm sitting there, another person stops to warn me that all trees are infested with ants. Bloomer's second tenet was that we give meaning to things based on our social interactions. The same thing can have a different meaning for different people. For the person talking to me, the tree is a breeding ground for creepy crawlies, and they are going to avoid it. But I'm quite happy with my seat in the shade, and I haven't been bothered by any ants, so I'm content just to sit. We have different views of the tree, and so we act differently. As I'm sitting there talking to this lovely person, I feel something tickle my shoulder, and suddenly I jump up as something bites my back. Turns out the tree was infested with ants. Now that I have been bitten under a tree, I might not sit under the next one I find because it might also be infested with ants. Bloomer's third tenet was that the meaning we give something is not permanent. It can change due to everyday life. The meaning I give to trees has changed after my interaction with the infested tree. A big tree now means shade on a hot day with a potential for getting bit. So let's sum up the 3 central ideas of symbolic interactionism. They are that action depends on meaning, that different people assign different meanings to things, and that the meaning of something can change. But there are some criticisms to symbolic interactionism as a theory, because it doesn't ask the same questions as the large-scale sociology theories do. It is sometimes considered as supplemental rather than a full theory, because it is restricted to studying small interactions between individuals. While this is true, symbolic interactionism gives a different perspective to sociology that is necessary for fully understanding a society. It is capable of explaining how aspects of society can change as they are created and recreated by social interactions. It examines society on a small scale and gives the individual the same importance as the society as a whole, and is a necessary view when studying a society.